on that, then on Kierkegaard's ideas, going further into it, one of the ways I was introduced to him was through his book Fear and Trembling. So that book, especially because of for me, is I've been on this faith, spiritual understanding. I guess, looking at the church,
Mhm.
looking at religion, and seeing the
Mhm.
difference and just different ways to, I guess, kind of approach faith. That book was very important because it kind of gave a new perspective on how to kind of tackle faith. And one thing, and I when we during our discussion, we spoke about, like, one thing he's attributed to saying is the idea of the leap of faith. But I think you mentioned to me that he's not actually said that. But yeah, could you speak a little bit more about that? His idea of the leap of faith, if it's not, even if it's not
Yeah,
actually
sure.
said it,
Uh,
but also yeah.
all I meant there was he doesn't use exactly that expression. He uses all those words in different
Mm,
sentences,
mm-hmm,
and that was in the concluding unscientific postscript. But fear and trembling is important in this way. So I think he says, look, in his own time, people would talk about pastors would talk about Abraham as the father of faith,
mm,
and there he points out that, well, listen, from a secular point of view, what Abraham did was what Abraham did was tantamount to murder. He's a murderer.
mm,
From a secular point of view, he's a murderer, and yet you folks calling him the father of faith. But what he did was, uh, well, from an ethical point of view, wrong.
mm-hmm,
So how can you hold these two positions together? And in there, he's trying to talk about the kind of fear and trembling that's required to make this to commit yourself to a life that's
mm-hmm,
not going to go. It's not in your short or long term best interest with regard to happiness, right? So it's
mm-hmm,
a radical thing, and he's trying to point out that the just how awesome faith because he thinks faith had been the Danish state church had turned into kind of a club mentality. Show up to church on Sunday, don't believe any of it, that kind of a thing. I mean, you literally there was a law that you had to go to church, and he's
mm,
trying to point out the rawness, the horror of faith. You know, right? That there's something really scary there, and so he says, okay, it's either you believe Abraham is a murderer, or you have to wonder, right?
yeah, yeah. And it's interesting too because that statement, about, like, Abraham being a murderer, just kind of like, like the idea of faith opposed to our moral, as a society, our moral kind of standards, and him kind of like showing us that it kind of sheds light on some of these ideas. I think, it sheds light on the, like, you are right. If we are kind of seen as a Christian society, how can we look at what Abraham does, and also, consider him like a murderer? Is that kind of idea that the religion has to be taken to a newer level, to even more kind
Right,
of embodied level.
right. And there's a lot of thinkers, even in his own time, that want to reduce religion to ethics, right?
Mm,
So he's saying, well, you can't do that because if the father of faith, what the father of faith was willing to do, wasn't
mm,
ethical,
mhm,
right? So there's this kind of so he basically saw the three ways of seeing the world. The ascetic way would be just judging it in terms of pleasure, unpleasure, right? Whether something's
mhm,
boring or interesting. Boring or interesting would be the dichotomy. From a religious point of view, it's from an ethical point of view, the second stage of life is seeing life in terms of good and evil. The third stage of life, the religious stage, is faith versus sin,
mhm,
right? And so these are three stages on life's way. It talks about three
mm.
different ways of seeing the world. Yeah.
I've also, like, learned that through, like, a lot of Kierkegaard's life, he was I wouldn't say, I don't know this for certain, but not a very happy person. I would say, he was very, like, tormented by his religious kind of, like, I guess his,
Yeah.
so would you recommend his ideas to people to try and live in modern
Well,
day?
I don't think he had a very crazy bringing up. He was the youngest child. Saw four of his siblings die before, I guess he was 20. His
Mm,
father was, I think, 50. I forget what his old. His father was an old guy when he
mhm,
had CERN. And at one point in his journals, he writes, and his journals are really interesting to read if you can get
Mhm.
copy of some of the selections. They're really amazing. But he he said my father destroyed my prospects for happiness.
Hmm.
Right? Made him an unhappy individual. Took away his childhood because he was really deep in some ways. His father really a very Socratic type figure,
Mm.
but he said he prepared me for faith, and for that I thank him for more than
Mm.
anything. But he would say he, the idea that he was tormented by faith. In some ways, he saw the rigorousness of faith, but also the love, the forget the grace, forgiveness.
Mm.
There's both
Mm.
there. He thinks both elements go together, right?
Mm. Mm. Also, and then on that point, then with kind of coming back to our modern kind of society right now, I think you look around. There's a lot of things that we kind of despair about. We talk about distractions. We were talking before social pressure, existential confusion. What do you think Kierkegaard would advise us how to tackle these kinds of despair in our modern time? Do you think he would tell us to turn to faith, or do you think there's some other things in his writing that he would kind of say these are more important to focus on?
Yeah. Okay. So first, let's draw a distinction between depression and despair. That's something I try to do in my book, which I
Mm,
think is in Kierkegaard's writings. He recognized that depression could be caused by crazy parent like father
mm,
like he had.
mhm,
Even suggests it could be genetic, and on the other hand, despair is for him. It's not a mood. It's a kind of giving up on God, giving up on faith, seeing yourself as a individual before God.
mm,
And I've tried to provide a secularized version of that. It'd be like giving up on your moral aspirations. Like suppose you all your life you want to be this kind and thoughtful
mhm,
person. And then you get in a bad space, bad things happen. You go, excuse my language, fuck it.
mhm,
I
mhm,
give up. I'm just gonna worry about myself.
mm,
So despair from a secular point of view, I think Kierkegaard would say, you're giving up on yourself, the very idea of yourself, thinking I'm in a
mm,
certain kind of self, right? So, I think it's a difference between a psychological problem,
mm,
disorder, say depression,
mhm,
versus a spiritual disorder, which I think we've lost in our culture.
mm,
Right? Spiritual disorder being something different than a psychological disorder. So no, it's not despair is not something you feel for Kierkegaard. It's a state of who you are. It's not a feeling. He says, for example, the happiness is the greatest hiding place for despair. Well, that's weird.
mm,
How could that be? Because when all the lights are green, you're making lots of money, everything's going your way. You're not inclined to think about what a jerk you can be, right?
mhm,
You know what I mean?
mhm, mhm.
Rich people, no one ever gives them any crap. It's always like, yeah, it's they don't get any
There's no
criticism.
repercussions. Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah.
things are all going your way. You're not inclined to think about. You haven't say, "Oh, thank God," as though you were blessed by God,
Mm,
as though your success or whatever was a blessing that God picked out for you, right? But
mhm,
despair is not that; it's a state of being. So despair, just imagine you have. I've heard people say, I'm tone deaf to the religious. Uh, just imagine you're the kind of person that just the idea of the sacred just seems
mm.
you can't buy it, man.
Yeah, there's a few people I know like that who kind of
Yeah,
see it as kind of like childish or almost, like fairy tale, like maybe because of the life they're living in, they don't can't really like the kind of ideas they can't really like take on.
yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. Doesn't hit home at all. Doesn't resonate.
Mm,
You
mm,
know.
mm. What would you say to people who feel that kind of despair? Like people, like I've mentioned, a lot of my generation had fallen into despair, or like maybe not right in it, but they kind of teetered on that edge. What would you say how to kind of like, be careful or like, to stave off that despair if it is possible?
Well, again, don't think about the despair from Kierkegaard's point of view as a feeling. Here, you're talking about people who become kind of cynical,
Mm,
don't feel as that. Yeah, that kind of state. That kind
mm-hmm,
of state. Yeah, well, he was the important thing to him was getting people to see to look in the mirror and to see that's where they are, you know?
Mm,
And, he actually thought that, when that when people get to that kind of radical position, there's a possibility of them going back and, making a change. I mean, you see that before where people, right?
mhm,
So, you know, a complete turnaround in their lives, right? Because the despair will lead to this intense position in life that the person will get out of, right? Will make the turn. But
mhm,
he was concerned that with the bourgeois, the bourgeois middle class culture just they have this little fantasy of spirituality and the materialistic. They really, so there's not going to be a lot of intensity there in terms of coming to a real position, your own position on life, right?
mhm,
Because you think you have it both. Yeah, I'm a spiritual. I meditate. I do mindfulness, and I'm going to the islands this weekend for a vacation. That kind of. He thinks that person's going to be harder. The minute he's very very hard on the bourgeois mentality, and
mm,
it's unusual given that people say, well, he was a rich man and he really was very rich. He
mm,
went through all his money, uh, but he's really concerned about that bourgeois mentality, the one I think we're in danger of, where you just give up on the politics of the world. On
yeah,
I'm not going to the demonstration against Trump today because it doesn't matter.
mm,
I mean, that's my before he was elected. I remember talking to all kinds of young folks like you
mhm,
in my country, and they're saying, "Oh, all politicians are the same." Let's just wait and see, baby. Wait and see. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
they
yeah,
don't realize the civil rights movement came out of politics, and
yeah,
the Social Security. They're all the same. Well, I don't think they're saying that now, but that's
yeah,
still that mode. How do you
yeah,
how do you yeah how do you get out of that sense of that cynical state of helpless state of mind, and not just concentrate on your next vacation or whatever it is,
mm,
and
mm.
and that's what
I
most
think
people do, right?
I think ironically, it's like opening yourself up to the world. When you're in that kind of despair, you talk about politics, people want to shut away from it because they don't want to even think about it. But ironically, once you look at it and you see that there are stuff that you can do, then I'll give you some sense of independence and responsibility to actually make change.
Mm,
But
mm,
again, it's so hard when we're all kind of stuck in our little boxes and our little rooms. It becomes difficult to connect to people, and see people as real people that that you want to make change with. And then I think this is something that I think through your work I've been able to see that, like, that you encourage people having courage, and be people that are seeking self knowledge. And I want to obviously now talk a little bit about that too. Before we actually go into that I know that you've written a book, The Existential Guide. So, talk to me about that. What was the inspiration for the book? And like, I know Kierkegaard, like we were just mentioning, features in that book too. So, how has he affected your writing, if at all?